In a small coastal town where dreams rust like abandoned machinery, Cal Bennett stands in his weathered auto shop, grease-stained hands, holding together more than just broken engines. The widowed father of 8-year-old Lila has watched his aerospace engineering career crumble, along with everything else he once built his life upon. When a sleek private helicopter makes an emergency landing near his shop, out steps Vivian Rother tech heiress, whose designer heels have never touched anything but marble floors. She expects quick service and quicker departure. Cal expects another entitled rich client. Neither expects the moment when her dismissive comment about people like him triggers something raw and honest from the depths of his grief-weathered soul. In 30 seconds of unfiltered truth about love, loss, and what really matters, Cal delivers words that will shatter her carefully constructed world and change both their lives forever. But what exactly did he say that left a billionaire speechless? The morning sun cast long shadows across Millbrook's weathered Main Street as Cal Bennett turned the key in his shop's front door. The familiar click of the deadbolt echoed in the quiet dawn, a sound that had marked the beginning of his workdays for 3 years now. Through the salt-stained window, he could see his reflection, a man of 42, whose shoulders carried more than their share of weight, whose hands bore the permanent stains of honest labor, whose eyes held depths that spoke of dreams deferred and losses endured. "Morning, Daddy," came the sleepy voice from behind him. Lila appeared in the doorway between the shop and their small apartment above, her auburn hair so much like her mother's catching the early light. At 8 years old, she possessed that peculiar mixture of innocence and wisdom that children of single parents often develop too quickly. "Morning, sweetheart," Cal replied, his voice softening in the way it always did when he spoke to his daughter. "You sleep well?" She nodded, clutching a hand-drawn picture that had become her constant companion, a family portrait rendered in crayon, showing the three of them, Cal, herself, and a faded figure with golden hair that she'd drawn and redrawn so many times the paper had grown thin in places. Sarah's presence lingered everywhere in their small world, sometimes as comfort, sometimes as an ache that threatened to steal his breath. The shop itself told the story of a man making do with what he had, tools hung on pegboard walls, with the precision of someone who understood that organization meant efficiency, and efficiency meant survival. The concrete floor bore decades of oil stains, each mark a testament to problems solved and vehicles returned to life. In the corner, almost hidden behind a stack of used tires, sat a weathered briefcase that Cal rarely opened anymore. Inside, beneath layers of dust and regret, lay the remnants of his former life. Diplomas, certifications, and a business card that read, Calvin Bennett, Senior Aerospace Engineer. Millbrook had once been a thriving coastal community, its economy anchored by the sprawling coastal aerospace manufacturing plant that employed nearly half the town's residents. The plant had been a testament to American ingenuity, producing components for commercial aircraft and military contracts that kept the community prosperous for 3 decades. Cal had been part of that prosperity, commuting daily to his position as a senior engineer, his mind filled with blueprints and calculations that turned raw materials into marvels of flight. But prosperity, like morning mist, had a way of dissipating when the winds of change blew hard enough. The recession hit like a storm surge, washing away jobs and dreams with equal indifference. Corporate restructuring became the euphemism for human displacement, and coastal aerospace became another casualty of economic efficiency. The plant closed on a grey Tuesday in October, and with it went not just jobs, but the very identity of a community. Cal's dismissal had come with a handshake and a severance package that seemed generous until it became the only barrier between his family and financial ruin. He'd spent months sending resumes into the void, watching his savings dwindle, while Sarah fought her own battle against the cancer that would ultimately claim her. The aerospace industry, once his calling, had contracted like a closed fist, offering no space for experienced engineers who found themselves on the wrong side of corporate mathematics. "Can we walk to school together today?" Lila asked, settling onto a worn stool beside his workbench. She'd learned to navigate the shop's obstacles with the sure-footedness of someone who'd grown up among them, treating wrenches and brake drums as familiar companions. "Of course we can," Cal said, checking his watch. "But first, how about some breakfast? I think we've got eggs, and maybe some of that good bread from Mrs. Chen's bakery." Mrs. Chen's bakery was one of the few businesses that had survived the economic downturn, sustained by the stubborn loyalty of neighbors who understood that community meant supporting each other through lean times. Her daughter Jessica had been Sarah's closest friend, and she'd taken it upon herself to look after Cal and Lila in the small ways that mattered most, a loaf of fresh bread left on their doorstep, a gentle inquiry about Lila's schoolwork, the kind of unspoken kindness that kept broken hearts from shattering completely. The morning routine unfolded with the comfortable efficiency of long practice. Cal prepared breakfast while Lila gathered her school supplies, their conversation flowing with the easy intimacy of two people who'd learned to be everything to each other. They talked about her upcoming science fair projector model airplane that would showcase the principles of flight and her favorite subject, mathematics, which she approached with the same methodical curiosity that had once driven her father's engineering career. "Daddy," she said over scrambled eggs, "why don't you fix airplanes anymore?" The question hung in the air, like smoke from an extinguished candle. Cal set down his fork, studying his daughter's earnest face. She asked this question periodically, with the persistent innocence of a child who couldn't understand why someone would abandon something they loved. "Well," he said carefully, "sometimes life changes the kind of work we can do. Right now, fixing cars and trucks is how I take care of us, and I'm good at it." "But you miss it," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sweetheart, I miss it." Their walk to school took them through the heart of Millbrook, past storefronts that bore the scars of economic hardship. Empty windows reflected their passage like dead eyes, while hand-lettered signs announced closures and liquidation sales. But there were signs of resilience too. Tom Miller's hardware store still opened every morning, sustained by the needs of people who'd learned to fix rather than replace. The post office remained a gathering place where neighbors shared news and offered mutual support. The elementary school, though showing its age, still welcomed children with the warmth of dedicated teachers who understood their role as more than educators. Cal walked Lila to her classroom, accepting the brief hug she offered before joining her classmates. Her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, greeted him with the kind of smile that spoke of genuine concern. "How are you holding up, Cal?" she asked quietly. "Day by day," he replied, the standard response that masked a multitude of struggles. "Lila's doing wonderfully. She's so bright, so curious about everything. You should be proud." Pride was a complicated emotion for Cal these days. He was proud of Lila, fiercely so, but pride in his own circumstances felt harder to access. He'd gone from designing systems that helped massive aircraft defy gravity to replacing brake pads and changing oil-honest work, necessary work, but work that used only a fraction of his capabilities. The walk back to his shop took him past the abandoned Aerospace plant, its parking lot cracked and overgrown with weeds. The building stood like a monument to dashed hopes, its windows dark, its loading docks silent. He'd driven past it countless times, but this morning he found himself stopping at the chain-link fence that surrounded the property. Through the wire mesh, he could see the main assembly floor, where he'd once worked alongside teams of skilled craftsmen and engineers. They'd been building the future in that space, creating components that would carry families safely across continents and soldiers safely home from distant conflicts. The work had felt important then, part of something larger than himself. Now the silence was complete except for the distant cry of seagulls and the whisper of wind through broken windows. A sign hung on the fence, "Property of Consolidated Holdings, LLC, no trespassing." The corporate name meant nothing to him, just another facet of the complex financial machinery that had ground his community to dust. Cal's phone buzzed with a text from his first customer of the day, pulling him back to the present. He had a transmission to rebuild and a radiator to replace work that would keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. As he walked back toward his shop, he passed Jimmy Patterson loading groceries into his truck. Jimmy had worked the assembly line for 22 years before the plant closed. Now he drove a delivery truck for a grocery chain in the next county, commuting 2 hours each way to earn half his former salary. "Morning, Cal," Jimmy called out. "Heard you might be looking at my alternator this week." "Bring her by whenever you're ready," Cal replied. "We'll get her running right." This was his world now, small problems, with practical solutions, neighbors helping neighbors, a pace of life that allowed for conversation and genuine concern. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life he'd built from the rubble of his previous existence. And most days, that felt like enough. Back in his shop, Cal reviewed the day's schedule. 3 oil changes, a brake job, and a diagnostic on Mrs. Peterson's Honda that had been making concerning noises. Routine work that he could complete efficiently, leaving his mind free to wander to other concerns. Lila's school supplies, the rent that was due at the end of the month, the persistent check engine light in his own truck that he'd been ignoring for weeks. He was reaching for his first work order when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the quiet rhythm of his morning. The deep thrum of rotor blades cutting through air, growing louder with each passing second. Cal stepped outside, shading his eyes against the morning sun, and watched as a sleek helicopter circled the town like a predator searching for prey. The aircraft was beautiful in the way that expensive machines often air all clean lines and purposeful design, its dark blue paint job gleaming despite the coastal humidity. It bore no commercial markings, suggesting private ownership of the kind that existed in a different economic universe from his own. As he watched, the helicopter's flight pattern changed, becoming more erratic, and he realized with the trained eye of someone who'd spent years understanding mechanical systems that something was wrong. The pilot was fighting for control now, the aircraft's movements becoming increasingly desperate as altitude dropped steadily toward the rocky coastline. Cal's engineering instincts kicked in automatically, his mind calculating wind patterns and landing options, even as his body moved toward the open space behind his shop. The helicopter needed a place to set down, and this might be its best option. The emergency landing happened with surprising grace, despite the obvious mechanical distress. The pilota woman, he could see, now managed to bring the aircraft down in the cleared area where Cal sometimes parked customer vehicles. The rotor wash sent debris flying in all directions, and the engine's labored whine spoke of serious internal problems that would require immediate attention. As the rotors wound down and the dust settled, the passenger door opened with the precise click of German engineering. What emerged was a vision that seemed to belong to a different world. Entirely, a woman in her late 30s with platinum blonde hair pulled back in a style that suggested both elegance and authority. Her clothing was clearly expensive, tailored to perfection, and her shoes were the kind that cost more than most people's monthly rent. She surveyed the scene with the cool assessment of someone accustomed to control, her expression revealing nothing beyond mild irritation at the inconvenience. When her eyes met Cal's, he saw intelligence there, and calculation, and something else, wariness that suggested she was as out of place here as he would be in her world. "Are you the mechanic?" she asked, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who expected immediate solutions to any problem. Cal wiped his hands on a shop rag, studying the woman and her disabled aircraft with equal measure. "I'm Cal Bennett," he said simply. "This is my shop, and that's a beautiful machine you've got there, even if she's not feeling too well at the moment." The woman's expression shifted slightly, as if she hadn't expected courtesy from someone whose hands were permanently stained with honest work. "Vivian Roth," she replied, extending a hand that had clearly never held anything heavier than a champagne flute. "And you're right about the machine. Something went wrong with the engine about 10 minutes ago. Can you fix it?" Cal looked at the helicopter, its sophisticated systems and precision engineering representing the kind of technology he'd once worked with daily. "I can take a look," he said, But this isn't exactly a carburetor and spark plugs. This is serious equipment that requires serious expertise. Are you saying you don't have the expertise? The question carried a subtle challenge, the kind of assumption that people like her made about people like him. Cal felt something shift inside him, a familiar anger that he'd learned to keep carefully controlled. "Ma'am," he said, his voice remaining steady, "I've been working with complex mechanical systems longer than you've probably been wearing shoes that cost more than some people's cars. The question isn't whether I have the expertise. The question is whether you want to trust someone who works with his hands to fix something that expensive." For the first time since stepping out of the helicopter, Vivian Roth looked genuinely surprised. Whatever response she'd expected, it wasn't this quiet confidence from a small-town mechanic who just called out her assumptions without raising his voice. In that moment, something hung in the air between thema recognition that neither was quite what the other had expected. The morning sun climbed higher, casting new shadows across the scene, while in the distance, the abandoned aerospace plant stood as a silent witness to the collision of two worlds that had more in common than either could yet imagine. The helicopter's engine ticked and pinged as it cooled, each sound telling Cal a story about stress and mechanical failure. He approached the aircraft with the careful attention of someone who understood that expensive machines could bite back when handled carelessly. The sleek lines of the fuselage caught the morning light, revealing craftsmanship that spoke to his engineer's soul, even as his current circumstances reminded him how far he'd fallen from that world. "What exactly happened up there?" he asked, circling the helicopter with practiced eyes. His hands moved instinctively, checking access panels and examining external components with the systematic approach that had once made him invaluable in aerospace diagnostics. Vivienne followed his movement, her designer heels clicking against the concrete with each step. The engine started running rough about 15 minutes into the flight. Then there was a grinding noise, and the pilot said we needed to land immediately. She paused, watching Cal's hands trace the helicopter's mechanical mysteries. "You really do know what you're looking at, don't you?" Cal didn't answer immediately. He was reading the machine's story in the way metal fatigue showed around stress points, in the pattern of oil residue near the engine compartment, in the subtle asymmetry that suggested recent vibration issues. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of genuine expertise. "Your pilot made the right call. This is a Eurocopter Econe 135, probably around 2018 model year. Beautiful machine, but she's got problems." He pointed to a series of panels along the engine housing. "I'm going to need to open her up to be sure, but I'm betting your main gearbox is developing issues. Could be bearing failure, could be gear tooth wear. Either way, it's not something you want to ignore." The pilot had been securing the rotor system during their conversation, but now he approached with the weathered confidence of someone who'd been flying for decades. "Name's Rick Martinez," he said, extending a hand to Cal. "Been flying for 30 years, and I've never heard an engine make sounds like that. You really think you can diagnose the problem?" Cal shook the offered hand, noting the calluses that marked Rick as someone who understood machines from the ground up. "I can try, but I'll need to see your maintenance manual, and I'll need access to diagnostic equipment that's probably worth more than my entire shop." Vivienne's expression shifted, revealing the first crack in her composed facade. "How long will that take?" "I have meetings in Boston this afternoon and a conference call with investors in Tokyo tonight." The casual mention of international business dealings hung in the air like a reminder of the different worlds they inhabited. Cal found himself studying this woman more carefully, the expensive watch that probably cost more than his annual income, the effortless elegance that spoke of a life lived entirely above the concerns that defined his existence. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "if what I think is wrong with your helicopter is actually wrong, you're not making any meetings today. Gearbox failure isn't something you patch up with duct tape and good intentions. This is precision machinery that requires precision parts and precision expertise." Vivienne's phone buzzed insistently, and she glanced at the screen with the practiced efficiency of someone who lived her life in 15-minute increments. My assistant is already rescheduling everything, she said, her fingers flying over the device's screen. But I need a timeline. How long are we talking about? Rick had been listening to the exchange with growing interest. You mind if I ask what your background is? Because you're talking about this bird like you've worked on her sisters before. Cal hesitated, feeling the familiar weight of explaining his transformed circumstances. I used to work in Aerospace. Spent 15 years as a systems engineer before. He gestured vaguely at his current surroundings. Before life took a different turn. Where'd you work? Rick pressed, his professional curiosity clearly piqued. Coastal Aerospace, mainly. Some contract work with Pratt Whitney, a few projects with Bell Helicopter. The names fell from his lips with the bittersweet familiarity of a language he'd once spoken fluently. Vivian looked up from her phone, her attention suddenly focused entirely on Cal. Coastal Aerospace? That was the plant that closed a few years ago, wasn't it? Something cold settled in Cal's stomach. The casual way she mentioned the plant's closure, as if it were merely a footnote in some larger economic story, triggered a familiar anger that he'd worked hard to keep buried. Yes, he said carefully, it closed 3 years ago, put about 800 people out of work. I remember reading about that, she continued, her tone maintaining the detached interest of someone discussing abstract market forces. Part of the broader consolidation in the defense sector, probably inevitable given the economic pressures. Cal's hands stilled on the helicopter's frame. In those few words, Vivian had reduced the destruction of his community to an economic inevitability, the kind of bloodless analysis that ignored the human cost of corporate decisions. He thought of Jimmy Patterson driving 2 hours each way to stock grocery shelves. He thought of Tom Miller's hardware store slowly dying as neighbors moved away to find work. He thought of his own daughter asking why he didn't fix airplanes anymore. Inevitable, he repeated, his voice still controlled but carrying a new edge. That's an interesting way to put it. Vivian, absorbed in her phone again, missed the warning in his tone. Well, yes, these things happen in cycles. Companies that can't adapt to changing market conditions inevitably get absorbed by more efficient operations. It's basic economics. The words hung in the air like a match dropped in gasoline fumes. Cal straightened slowly, his engineer's mind calculating not trajectories and stress loads, but the weight of 3 years' worth of suppressed frustration and grief. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet intensity of someone who'd finally reached his limit. Let me tell you something about inevitable, Ms. Roth, he said, his hands now completely still on the helicopter's frame. 800 families losing their livelihoods wasn't inevitable, it was a choice. A choice made by people who never had to look their neighbors in the eye and explain why they couldn't afford Christmas presents that year. Vivian's fingers paused over her phone screen, her attention now fully focused on the man before her. Cal continued, his voice gaining strength as words he'd never spoken aloud began to flow. You see this town? You see these empty storefronts and boarded-up houses? That's not basic economics. That's what happens when people who've never worked a day in their lives with their hands decide that human beings are just line items on a spreadsheet. Rick had stopped his post-flight inspection entirely, recognizing that something significant was happening between the mechanic and his passenger. My wife died 2 years ago, Cal said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his grief and anger. Cancer. You know what she worried about during her last months? Not dying. She worried about whether I'd be able to take care of our daughter after she was gone, whether I'd be able to keep our house, pay for Lila's school supplies, put food on the table. She died worrying about things that shouldn't have been worries, because I used to have a job that paid me enough to take care of my family. Vivian's phone had gone silent in her hands, her earlier composure beginning to crack as she faced the raw reality behind the economic abstractions she'd casually dismissed. So don't talk to me about inevitable, Cal continued, his eyes meeting hers directly. Talk to me about choices, about responsibility, about what happens when people who live in helicopters make decisions that destroy the lives of people who fix them. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant cry of seagulls and the whisper of wind through the abandoned aerospace plant visible in the distance. Vivian stood frozen, her expensive phone forgotten in her hands, as the weight of Cal's words settled over her like a heavy blanket. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, someone had forced her to confront the human cost of the abstract economic forces she'd spent her career manipulating. The man before her wasn't just a mechanic or a former engineer, he was the embodiment of consequences she'd never had to face personally. She began, then stopped, realizing that none of her usual responses felt adequate to the moment. Cal turned his attention back to the helicopter, his hands resuming their systematic examination of the aircraft systems. "I'll need about 2 hours to properly diagnose the problem," he said, his voice returning to its earlier professional tone. "There's a diner about 2 blocks down Main Street if you want coffee while you wait. Or you can sit in my office as it is." Rick cleared his throat, breaking the tension that still crackled in the air. "I'll stick around to help however I can," he said quietly. "Been wanting to understand these newer systems better anyway." Vivienne remained motionless for another moment, studying Cal as he worked with renewed focus on her helicopter. Something fundamental had shifted in the space between thema recognition, that this wasn't just about mechanical failure, but about the collision of 2 worlds that had suddenly revealed their painful interconnection. "I'll wait," she said finally, her voice smaller than before. "If that's all right?" Cal nodded without looking up from his work, already deep in the mental calculations that would determine whether Vivienne Roth's expensive machine could be returned to the sky, or whether she'd be forced to remain grounded in a world where the consequences of distant decisions were written in the lines of every face she'd meet. As he began to remove the access panels that would reveal the helicopter's mechanical secrets, Cal couldn't shake the feeling that this morning's emergency landing had brought more than just a disabled aircraft into his life. It had brought a reckoning that had been 3 years in the making, delivered by a woman who was about to learn that sometimes the most expensive repairs weren't measured in dollars, but in the cost of confronting truths that comfortable lives had allowed her to ignore. The diagnostic process revealed itself to be more complex than Cal had initially anticipated. 2 hours stretched into 4 as he traced hydraulic lines and examined gear assemblies with the methodical precision that had once made him indispensable in aerospace troubleshooting. The helicopter's sophisticated systems sang familiar songs to his trained earth whisper of pressurized lines, the precise tolerances of German engineering, the subtle harmonics that distinguished healthy machinery from mechanical distress. Vivienne had retreated to his small office, a cramped space that served as both business headquarters and overflow storage for parts catalogs that predated the internet. She sat perched on the edge of his desk chair, her phone maintaining its relentless electronic heartbeat as assistants, lawyers, and business partners demanded her attention from across time zones. Yet Cal noticed that her responses had become increasingly distracted, her usual rapid-fire decision-making replaced by longer pauses and requests for delays. "Your main transmission bearing is failing," Cal announced, emerging from beneath the helicopter's engine, cowling with grease-darkened hands. "It's not catastrophic yet, but it's moving in that direction fast. Flying her again without replacement parts would be like playing Russian roulette with very expensive bullets." Rick whistled low, running a hand through his graying hair. "How expensive are we talking about for the repair?" Cal pulled out his phone, scrolling through parts databases that connected him to suppliers he hadn't contacted in years. "The bearing assembly alone is going to run about $12,000. Installation requires specialized tools and certification that I don't have. You're looking at a minimum 2-day repair timeline, assuming we can get the parts shipped overnight." 2 days? Vivienne's voice carried a note of disbelief as she appeared in the office doorway. "I have a board meeting on Thursday that I cannot miss." "Ma'am," Cal said patiently, "your other option is to have the helicopter transported to a certified repair facility. That's probably your best bet anyway, given the complexity of the work involved." But even as he said the words, Cal found himself studying the helicopter's systems with renewed interest. The challenge appealed to something deep in his engineer's soul, the kind of complex problem-solving that had once defined his professional identity. He'd worked on similar transmission systems during his aerospace days, and while this particular application was different, the underlying principles remained familiar territory. Vivienne's phone buzzed again, its screen displaying a contact labeled Board Chairman. She stared at the device for a long moment before declining the Calla gesture that seemed to surprise her as much as it did Cal. "What would it take for you to do the repair?" she asked suddenly. Cal looked up from the parts catalogue he'd been consulting, meeting her gaze directly. "Honestly, more than I can provide. This isn't just about having the right parts, it's about certification, liability, specialized equipment that costs more than my entire shop is worth." "But you could do the work itself?" There was something in her voice that made Cal Posano the imperious demand of someone accustomed to buying solutions, but genuine curiosity about his capabilities. "Technically, yes. I've rebuilt similar transmissions before, but what if the liability wasn't an issue? What if you had access to whatever equipment you needed?" Rick had been listening to this exchange with growing interest. "You're talking about bringing in a mobile certification team," he said slowly. "That's not unheard of for aircraft stranded in remote locations, but it's expensive as hell." Vivienne's attention remained fixed on Cal. "How expensive?" "Probably 40,000 all told," Rick replied. "Maybe more, depending on how quickly you need it done." For the first time since her helicopter had made its emergency landing, Vivienne smiled, not the practiced expression of corporate diplomacy, but something that seemed genuinely amused by the irony of her situation. "So you're telling me that the most economical solution to my problem is to trust a small-town mechanic with a multi-million-dollar aircraft?" Cal felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Ma'am, if you're not comfortable—" "I didn't say I wasn't comfortable," she interrupted. "I'm just noting the irony. This morning I was flying over your town thinking about market inefficiencies and resource allocation. Now I'm discovering that the most efficient solution to my problem requires trusting someone I initially dismissed." The words hung between them, carrying weight that went beyond helicopter repairs. Cal studied her face, searching for signs of the condescension that had marked their earlier interaction. Instead, he found something that looked almost like vulnerability, as if his earlier words had forced her to question assumptions she'd never examined before. "I'll need to make some calls," Cal said finally. "See what I can arrange on short notice. But I want to be clear about something. I haven't done this kind of work in 3 years. My certification lapsed when the plant closed. If something goes wrong—" "Something's already wrong," Vivienne pointed out. "The question is whether we try to fix it or accept defeat." Over the next several hours, Cal found himself making phone calls to contacts he hadn't spoken to since his aerospace days. Some conversations were warm reunions with former colleagues who'd scattered to other industries. Others carried the awkward weight of professional relationships that had ended abruptly when economic forces larger than any individual career had reshuffled the deck. But gradually, solutions emerged. A former supervisor, now working for a certification company in Boston, could arrange for mobile inspection services. A parts supplier in Hartford confirmed overnight delivery of the transmission bearing. A tool rental company in Providence had the specialized equipment necessary for precision helicopter maintenance. As afternoon faded into evening, Cal's small shop began to feel less like an automotive repair facility and more like the staging area for a complex technical operation. Rick had proven invaluable, his decades of flight experience providing crucial context for the repair requirements. Vivienne had surprised them both by rolling up her sleeves literally, in the case of her expensive silk blouse, and assisting with tasks that required additional hands. "You don't have to do this," Cal told her as she held a work light steady while he examined bearing specifications. "This is pretty far outside your usual line of work, I'm guessing." "You'd be surprised," she replied. "I didn't start out in boardrooms and corner offices. My first job was rebuilding computer systems in my college's engineering lab." The revelation added another layer to Cal's understanding of the woman who'd emerged from the helicopter that morning. "What did you study?" Electrical engineering, with a focus on systems integration. I was going to design better computers. Instead, I ended up designing better ways to make money from other people's computers. There was something almost wistful in her voice, as if she were remembering a version of herself that had gotten lost somewhere along the path to extraordinary wealth. Cal found himself wondering what forces had transformed an engineering student into the kind of person who casually dismissed the closure of manufacturing plants as economic inevitability. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "The actual engineering work?" Vivienne considered the question while adjusting the work light's angle. "I haven't thought about it in years, but watching you diagnose this transmission problem, there's something satisfying about solving puzzles that have real, physical solutions." As the evening wore on, they developed an unlikely rhythm of collaboration. Cal's diagnostic expertise, combined with Rick's operational knowledge and Vivienne's unexpected familiarity with complex systems, created a team that functioned more smoothly than any of them had anticipated. The helicopter, which had seemed like an intrusion that morning, now felt like a bridge connecting three people who might never have spoken under normal circumstances. "I should call my daughter," Cal said as the sun began to set behind the coastal hills. "Let her know I'll be working late." "You have a daughter?" Vivienne asked, and Cal caught something in her voice, no quite surprise, but something more complex. "Lila, she's 8, stays with our neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, when I have to work past school hours." As Cal made the call, explaining to Lila that he had an important repair job that might keep him busy for the next couple of days, Vivienne found herself studying the small personal touches that marked his workspace. A child's drawing taped to his tool cabinet, a coffee mug with "World's Best Dad" printed in fading letters, a small framed photo of Cal with a red-haired woman and a younger version of Lila, all three smiling at the camera with the unconscious happiness of people who'd never imagined their world could fall apart. When Cal ended the call, he found Vivienne looking at the family photo with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Your wife?" she asked quietly. "Sarah. She died 2 years ago. I'm sorry." The words came out with surprising gentleness, devoid of the awkward platitudes that people usually offered when confronted with grief they couldn't understand. "She would have gotten a kick out of all this," Cal said, gesturing at the helicopter that dominated his small workspace. "Sarah always said I was at my best when I was solving problems that seemed impossible." For the first time since morning, silence settled between them that felt comfortable rather than tense. Outside, the coastal evening painted everything in shades of gold and purple, while inside, three strangers continued working toward a solution that none of them had anticipated when the day began. The next morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that only coastal dawns can provide, salt-tinged air carrying the promise of another day, where the impossible might become merely difficult. Cal had arrived at his shop before sunrise, unable to sleep through the anticipation of the repair work ahead. The specialized tools had arrived as promised, along with certification inspectors who approached the helicopter with the reverent attention that expensive machinery commanded. Vivienne had spent the night at the Millbrook Inn, a modest establishment that probably represented her first encounter with accommodations that didn't feature marble bathrooms and thread counts measured in the thousands. When she appeared at the shop that morning, Cal noticed subtle changes her hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail rather than an executive's perfect arrangement. Her clothing chosen for function rather than boardroom presentations. "How did you sleep?" Cal asked, noting the slight shadows under her eyes that suggested unfamiliarity with the inn's vintage mattresses and the town's natural soundtrack of wind and waves. "Differently," she replied with a rueful smile. "I'd forgotten what silence sounds like. My apartment in Boston overlooks the harbor, but there's always traffic, always sirens, always something. Here, I could hear my own thoughts." The comment revealed more than she might have intended. Cal found himself wondering what kinds of thoughts emerged when a person like Vivienne Roth encountered genuine quiet for the first time in years. Work on the helicopter proceeded with the methodical precision that complex repairs demanded. The certification team had approved Cal's repair plan. their initial skepticism dissolving as they observed his systematic approach to transmission diagnostics. Rick proved invaluable as a liaison between the formal requirements of aircraft maintenance and the practical realities of field repairs. But it was during a break in the morning's work that the day's most significant moment occurred. Lila appeared at the shop's entrance, her school backpack slung over one shoulder and her eyes wide with curiosity about the helicopter that had transformed her father's workspace. "Daddy, Mrs. Patterson said you had an airplane in your shop," she announced, her voice carrying the excitement of a child who discovered that ordinary days could suddenly become extraordinary. Cal wiped his hands on a shop rag, his attention immediately shifting to his daughter. "Not exactly an airplane, sweetheart. It's a helicopter, and the lady who owns it is here while we fix it." Lila's gaze found Vivienne, who was standing beside the aircraft with a wrench in her hand and a bemused expression on her face. For a moment, the two regarded each other across the span of Cal's shop, the 8-year-old daughter of a widowed mechanic and the tech heiress whose world existed in an entirely different dimension of possibility. "You're very pretty," Lila said with the absolute honesty that children wielded like surgical instruments. "Are you rich?" "Lila," Cal warned gently, but Vivienne held up a hand. "It's all right," she said, kneeling down to Lila's eye level. "Yes, I suppose I am rich. Does that bother you?" Lila considered this question with the seriousness of someone who'd learned early that adult conversations often carried hidden meanings. "I don't think so," she said finally. "Daddy says being rich or poor doesn't matter as much as being kind." The simple statement hung in the air with surprising weight. Vivienne found herself studying this child, who spoke with such matter-of-fact wisdom about concepts that adults spent lifetimes wrestling with. "Your daddy sounds very wise." "He is," Lila agreed. "He knows how to fix everything. Well, almost everything." Her expression grew momentarily serious. "He couldn't fix Mommy." The words struck Vivienne with unexpected force. In her world, problems yielded to sufficient application of resources and expertise. The idea of a problem that couldn't be solved, a situation where love and skill and determination weren't enough, challenged assumptions she hadn't realized she held. Cal moved to his daughter's side, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Sometimes things break in ways that can't be fixed, sweetheart. But that doesn't mean we stop trying to fix the things we can." "Like the helicopter?" Lila asked. "Like the helicopter," Cal confirmed. Vivienne watched this exchange with growing fascination. The easy intimacy between father and daughter, the way they navigated difficult conversations with honesty, tempered by appropriate protection. The genuine affection that radiated from their interaction, all of it, represented something she'd observed from a distance but never experienced directly. "Would you like to see inside the helicopter?" Vivienne found herself asking. "I mean, if your daddy says it's okay." Cal's expression showed surprise, but he nodded. "Just be careful, and don't touch anything that looks important." For the next 20 minutes, Vivienne found herself serving as tour guide to an aircraft she'd previously taken for granted. Through Lila's eyes, she began to see the helicopter as something magical rather than merely functional, a machine that could lift human beings into the sky, that represented humanity's refusal to accept the limitations of ground-bound existence. "How fast does it go?" Lila asked, settling into the pilot's seat with barely contained excitement. "About 150 miles per hour, Vivienne replied. "Fast enough to get from here to Boston in less than an hour." "Wow. Do you fly it to work every day?" The question prompted something approaching embarrassment in Vivienne. "Sometimes, when I'm in a hurry." "That must be expensive," Lila observed, with the practical wisdom of a child who'd learned to think about money in terms of groceries and school supplies. "Yes," Vivienne admitted, "it is expensive. But you do it anyway because you can." The question was asked without judgment, but it carried implications that made Vivienne uncomfortable. Through this child's perspective, her casual use of extraordinary resources seemed less like efficiency and more like indulgence. As Lila explored the helicopter's interior, asking questions that revealed both curiosity and intelligence, Vivian found herself drawn into conversation about subjects she hadn't considered in years. What it felt like to fly above the clouds, whether the pilot got scared during storms, why someone would want to travel so fast when there were interesting things to see along the way. "Mrs. Vivienne," Lila said as her exploration wound down, "do you have any kids?" The question hit Vivienne with unexpected force. "No," she said quietly, "I don't." "Why not?" Cal started to intervene, but Vivienne shook her head slightly. "I suppose I've been too busy with work," she said, the answer sounding inadequate even to herself. "That's sad," Lila replied with characteristic directness. "Kids are the best part of grown-up life. At least, that's what Daddy always says." When Lila finally returned to school, promising to come back after classes to check on the repair progress, Vivian found herself standing in Cal's shop with a strange sense of displacement. The child's questions had forced her to examine her life from an entirely new perspective, revealing choices that had seemed logical in isolation but appeared differently when viewed through the lens of genuine human connection. "She's remarkable," Vivienne said as they watched Lila skip down the street toward school. "She is," Cal agreed, his voice carrying the quiet pride of a parent who'd discovered that the most important thing he'd ever built wasn't made of metal and engineering specifications. "How do you do it?" Vivienne asked suddenly. "Raise a child alone, run a business, deal with everything that's happened to you, and still maintain that kind of connection?" Cal was quiet for a long moment, his attention apparently focused on the wedding ring he still wore on his left hand. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "I guess you learn that the important things aren't actually that complicated," he said. "Love your family, do honest work, help your neighbors when you can. Everything else is just noise." The simplicity of his answer both appealed to and terrified Vivienne. In her world, success was measured in quarterly earnings and market valuations, in hostile takeovers and strategic acquisitions. The idea that fulfillment might come from something as basic as loving your family and doing honest work challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which she'd built her entire identity. As they returned to work on the helicopter, Vivian found herself thinking not about the meetings she was missing or the deals that were proceeding without her input, but about an 8-year-old girl who thought being kind mattered more than being rich, and about her father who'd somehow managed to build something meaningful from the wreckage of his dreams. The transmission-bearing replacement proceeded smoothly under the watchful eyes of the certification team. Cal's hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd returned to his natural element, while Vivian discovered that her old engineering instincts hadn't disappeared entirely. They'd simply been buried under years of corporate strategy and financial maneuvering. By late afternoon, the helicopter's systems were running smoothly, its mechanical heartbeat restored to the precise rhythms that would carry it safely back into the sky. But as Cal listened to the engine's healthy purr during the final test run, he found himself wondering whether some repairs were more complex than others, and whether the most important fixing that had happened that day had nothing to do with transmission bearings and everything to do with the slow, careful work of rebuilding human connection. The helicopter's successful test flight should have marked the end of Vivian's unexpected sojourn in Millbrook, but as Rick completed his pre-departure checklist, she found herself creating reasons to delay their departure. A few phone calls that couldn't wait, some paperwork that required her personal attention. Technical specifications she wanted to review one more time with Cal to ensure the repair's longevity. Cal recognized the delaying tactics for what they were, but he didn't call attention to them. Something had shifted between them over the past 2 days, not quite friendship, but no longer the adversarial tension that had marked their initial encounter. As he cleaned his tools and restored his shop to its normal configuration, he found himself reluctant to see her leave. "I'd like to see the plant," Vivian said suddenly as Cal was securing the specialized equipment for return to the rental company. "The Aerospace facility you mentioned. Would you show it to me?" The request surprised him. It's not much to see anymore, just an empty building and a lot of broken dreams. Still, she said, I'd like to understand what was lost. The walk to the abandoned plant took them through the heart of Millbrook's commercial district, past storefronts that told the story of a community's struggle to reinvent itself. Some businesses had adapted Tom Miller's hardware store, now carried more consumer goods and fewer industrial supplies. The diner had expanded its hours to accommodate shift workers from the regional hospital. But the empty spaces outnumbered the occupied ones, creating gaps in the streetscape like missing teeth. It wasn't always like this, Cal said as they passed a boarded-up clothing store. When the plant was running, this whole stretch was busy. People had money to spend, reasons to stay, hope for their kids' futures. Vivian listened without comment, her attention caught by details that revealed the community's resilience alongside its struggle. Window boxes maintained with care, despite empty buildings. Fresh paint on structures that housed thriving businesses. Children's artwork displayed in school windows, bright and optimistic despite the economic uncertainty that surrounded them. The Aerospace plant dominated the horizon as they approached, its massive structure a testament to an era when American manufacturing had seemed unshakable. The parking lot, once filled with the cars of 3 shifts of workers, now hosted weeds and scattered debris. Chain-link fencing topped with razor wire surrounded the perimeter, while signs warned against trespassing on property owned by Consolidated Holdings, LLC. 800 people worked here, Cal said, stopping at the fence that separated them from his former workplace. 3 shifts, 7 days a week, during peak production. We built components for commercial aircraft, military helicopters, even some NASA contracts. Through the mesh of the fence, Vivian could see the main assembly floor through windows that hadn't been properly maintained since the closure. The space that had once hummed with purposeful activity now stood silent and empty, its massive overhead cranes frozen in positions that suggested interrupted work rather than planned shutdown. What kinds of components? She asked, her engineering background making her curious about the technical details. Cal's voice took on the enthusiasm that always emerged when he discussed his former work. Transmission assemblies mostly, but also hydraulic systems and some avionics integration. We specialized in precision work components, where a millimeter's tolerance could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. As he spoke, Vivian found herself studying his profile, noting how his entire demeanor changed when he talked about engineering challenges. The quiet resignation that had marked their earlier conversations disappeared, replaced by the animated engagement of someone discussing work that had truly mattered to him. The irony is that we were good at what we did, Cal continued. Our quality ratings were among the highest in the industry. We met delivery schedules, stayed within budget constraints, maintained safety records that were the envy of our competitors. Then why did it close? Vivian asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Economics, Cal said, the word carrying years of bitter understanding. Consolidated Holdings bought our parent company as part of a larger acquisition strategy. They weren't interested in our manufacturing capabilities, they wanted our contracts and our client relationships. The actual production got moved to facilities in Mexico and China, where labor costs were lower. The explanation hit Vivian with uncomfortable familiarity. She'd been involved in similar acquisitions throughout her career, though always from the strategic planning side rather than the human impact side. The logic was always the same: maximize shareholder value through operational efficiency, regardless of the consequences for individual communities. How long did you work here? She asked. 15 years. Started right out of college as a junior engineer, worked my way up to senior systems analyst. I thought I'd retire here, maybe even see Lila follow in my footsteps if she showed interest in engineering. They stood in silence for several minutes, looking through the fence at the abandoned facility. Vivian found herself trying to imagine the space filled with workers, alive with the sounds of precision manufacturing, purposeful in ways that her current business ventures rarely achieved. What would it take to reopen it? She asked suddenly. Cal looked at her with surprise. Reopen the plant? That's not really possible. The equipment was sold off, the skilled workforce scattered, the client contracts transferred to other facilities. But hypothetically, Vivienne pressed, if someone wanted to restart aerospace manufacturing here, what would be required? Cal considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Well, you'd need modern equipment, probably $50 to $75 million worth of machinery and tooling. You'd need to rebuild the workforce, which means training programs and probably recruiting experienced workers from other facilities. You'd need contracts, which means convincing clients to shift production back to a facility with no recent track record. And you'd need someone crazy enough to invest that kind of money in an industry that's increasingly dominated by offshore production and corporate consolidation. Cal's smile carried more sadness than humor. In other words, it's not happening. But Vivienne wasn't ready to abandon the hypothetical. What if the investment wasn't purely profit-driven? What if someone wanted to prove that high-quality manufacturing could still be profitable in American communities? You're talking about a massive financial risk for what would essentially be a social experiment, Cal replied. The kind of risk that corporations don't take and individuals can't afford. As they walked back toward the shop, Vivienne found herself mentally calculating numbers that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or market position. The cost of modern manufacturing equipment, the timeline for workforce development, the logistics of securing aerospace contracts in a highly competitive industry. "Why are you asking?" Cal said as they reached the main street again. Vivienne hesitated, uncertain how to articulate thoughts that were still forming. "I suppose I'm trying to understand whether the damage can be undone, whether communities like this one are permanently broken or just temporarily displaced." "That's a question that a lot of people around here have been wrestling with for 3 years, Cal said. "So far, nobody's come up with a good answer." They parted ways at Cal's shop, Vivienne returning to the inn to make the phone calls that would extend her stay another day. But instead of focusing on the business matters that demanded her attention, she found herself researching aerospace manufacturing, studying industry trends and production costs, with the methodical approach that had made her successful in technology acquisition. Late that evening, as Millbrook settled into the quiet rhythms of a small coastal town, Vivienne sat in her modest inn-room, surrounded by printouts and laptop screens, building financial models for an idea that grew more concrete with each passing hour. Outside her window, she could see the lights of Cal's apartment above his shop, where a single father was probably helping his daughter with homework or reading bedtime stories, living a life that seemed both impossibly simple and impossibly meaningful compared to her own. For the first time in years, Vivienne found herself contemplating a business decision that wasn't driven by market advantage or competitive positioning, but by something much more complex, the recognition that some kinds of success couldn't be measured in profit margins, and that the most important repairs sometimes required rebuilding something that had been broken not by mechanical failure, but by the casual cruelty of economic forces that treated human communities as expendable resources. The Millbrook Elementary School's science fair occupied the gymnasium with the earnest enthusiasm that marked all childhood endeavors, where adults pretended that winning didn't matter, while children understood that everything mattered tremendously. Cal arrived early to help Lila set up her projector meticulously constructed model airplane that demonstrated the principles of lift, thrust, drag, and gravity through working wing flaps and a small electric motor. "Remember, sweetheart," Cal said as they arranged her display board, "the important thing isn't whether you win or lose. It's whether you can explain how it works and why it matters." Lila nodded seriously, her attention focused on adjusting the angle of her model's wings for optimal demonstration effect. "I know, Daddy, but it would still be nice to win." Cal smiled at his daughter's honesty. At 8 years old, she possessed the kind of straightforward ambition that adults learned to disguise behind more socially acceptable motivations. Her project reflected months of after-school work in his shop, with Cal patiently explaining aerodynamic principles while Lila applied them with the focused determination that reminded him daily of her mother's approach to challenges. "Well, if Mrs. Vivian comes like she said she would, make sure you explain how the wing design affects airflow patterns," Cal suggested. "She'll understand the engineering better than most of the judges." The fact that Vivian had expressed interest in attending the science fair still surprised him. Her extended stay in Millbrook had already stretched beyond any reasonable business justification, yet she seemed reluctant to return to Boston and the corporate responsibilities that presumably demanded her attention. The gymnasium began filling with families as the evening progressed, creating the comfortable chaos that defined community events in small towns. Parents compared their children's projects with the competitive undertones that marked suburban warfare, while kids explained complex scientific concepts with the confidence of youth unburdened by adult doubts. Vivian arrived as the judging was beginning, her presence immediately noticeable among the collection of local families. She'd chosen her clothing carefully, still elegant, but not so formal as to create uncomfortable distance from the other parents. Cal watched her navigate the social dynamics with interest, noting how she listened more than she spoke and asked questions that demonstrated genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. "Mrs. Vivian," Lila called out when she spotted her across the gymnasium. "Come see my airplane." As Vivian approached their display, Cal noticed how other parents watched her with the mixture of curiosity and suspicion that strangers always attracted in close-knit communities. He recognized several neighbors among the crowd: Jimmy Patterson, whose son had built a volcano that actually erupted; Maria Santos, whose daughter's solar panel project could power a small LED array; Tom Miller, whose grandson had constructed an elaborate marble run that demonstrated physics principles through pure kinetic energy. "This is impressive work," Vivian said as Lila began her practiced presentation. "Can you tell me about your wing design?" For the next 15 minutes, Lila held Vivian's complete attention, explaining how she'd tested different wing configurations and adjusted the motor placement to achieve optimal flight characteristics. Cal found himself watching Vivian's face as much as listening to his daughter's presentation, noting how her expression shifted from polite interest to genuine engagement as Lila's explanations revealed the depth of thought behind the project. "The hardest part was getting the weight distribution right," Lila was saying. "Daddy explained that real airplanes have the same problem, but they use computers to figure out all the math." "That's exactly right," Vivian replied. "In fact, the company where I work develops software that helps engineers solve those kinds of problems for real aircraft." "Really? Could you show me sometime?" The innocent request created a moment of silence that stretched beyond comfortable social limits. Cal realized that Lila's question assumed a future where Vivian would still be part of their lives, an assumption that hadn't been explicitly discussed by the adults involved. "I'd like that very much," Vivian said finally, her voice carrying a sincerity that surprised even Cal. As the evening progressed, Cal watched Vivian interact with other families, noting how she navigated conversations about local concerns with increasing confidence. She listened to Maria Santos describe the challenges of finding work that accommodated her daughter's after-school care needs. She discussed community development with Tom Miller, whose hardware store served as an unofficial town hall for residents wrestling with economic uncertainty. But it was her conversation with Jimmy Patterson that proved most revealing. Jimmy's son had won second place for his volcano project, and the family was celebrating at the refreshment table when Vivian approached to offer congratulations. "That's quite an accomplishment," she said to Jimmy's 10-year-old son. "I bet you learned a lot about chemical reactions." "Yeah, it was awesome when it erupted," the boy replied, with enthusiasm that only children could bring to controlled explosions. Jimmy extended his hand to Vivian with the careful politeness that working-class people often showed toward obvious wealth. "I'm Jimmy Patterson. I don't think we've met formally." "Vivian Roth. I'm visiting town while my helicopter gets repaired." "Helicopter," Jimmy repeated, his tone carrying gentle amazement. "That's not something we see much around here." "No, I imagine not." Vivian paused, then continued with something approaching vulnerability. "Jimmy, can I ask you something? Cal mentioned you used to work at the aerospace plant. What was it like there?" Jimmy's expression grew thoughtful, his attention shifting from polite conversation to something more serious. "Best job I ever had," he said simply. "Good pay, good benefits, work that mattered. I was on the assembly line for transmission component sievery piece that went through my station was destined for aircraft that would carry people safely home. Do you miss it?" Every day. Jimmy's honesty carried weight that surprised Vivienne. "I mean, I'm grateful for the work I have now, driving delivery truck for the grocery chain. But it's not the same. There's no pride in it, you know? No sense that what you're doing makes a difference." As Jimmy spoke, other former plant workers began gathering around their conversation. Maria Santos had worked in quality control. Tom Miller's brother had been a maintenance supervisor. Even Mrs. Chen, who'd supplied lunch for the plant's cafeteria, had felt the economic impact when 800 steady customers disappeared overnight. "What would it take to bring something like that back?" Vivienne asked, her question addressing the group rather than Jimmy alone. The question generated the kind of uncomfortable silence that emerged when people were asked to hope for things that experience had taught them to consider impossible. "Someone with deep pockets and a willingness to lose money," Jimmy said finally. "The global economy doesn't much care about places like Millbrook anymore." "But if someone did care," Vivienne pressed, "if someone wanted to prove that American manufacturing could still be competitive, what would be required from the community?" Tom Miller spoke up from the edge of the group. "Workers willing to retrain on new equipment, local government willing to work with developers on zoning and infrastructure, community support for the kind of changes that come with industrial development. And patience," Maria added. "It would take years to build up the kind of operation we had before, years where everyone would be taking risks without guarantees." As the conversation continued, Cal found himself watching Vivienne with growing curiosity. Her questions were too specific, too informed, to represent casual interest. She was gathering information with the systematic approach of someone conducting preliminary research for a project that existed beyond hypothetical discussion. The science fair concluded with Lila earning third place for her airplane project, a result that pleased her more than her diplomatic acceptance speech suggested. As families began clearing their displays and heading home, Vivienne lingered near Cal and Lila's table. "She's remarkable," Vivienne said as they packed up Lila's materials. "The depth of understanding behind that project. She's going to be an excellent engineer someday." "If she wants to be," Cal replied. "Right now she's torn between engineering and veterinary medicine. Last week she was convinced she wanted to be a marine biologist." Smart to keep her options open. Though I have to say, listening to her explain aerodynamics tonight reminded me why I fell in love with engineering in the first place. The comment revealed more than Vivienne might have intended. Cal found himself studying her profile as she watched Lila carefully pack her model airplane, noting something wistful in her expression that suggested recognition of paths not taken. "Vivienne," he said quietly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "What are you really doing here? I mean, your helicopter's been ready to fly for 2 days, but you keep finding reasons to stay. What's going on?" Vivienne was quiet for a long moment, her attention apparently focused on helping Lila secure her project materials. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the uncertainty of someone articulating thoughts that were still forming. "I think I'm trying to understand something that I've never had to think about before," she said. "What it means to be part of a community, what it feels like to do work that connects you to the people around you instead of separating you from them. And I'm beginning to think that everything I've spent my career building might be less important than what was lost when places like this started disappearing." As they walked toward the gymnasium exit, Cal found himself processing implications that extended far beyond casual observation. Vivienne's questions to the former plant workers, her extended stay in Millbrook, her growing connection to Lila and to the community's struggles, all of it, suggested someone wrestling with decisions that went beyond personal curiosity. Outside, the coastal evening painted everything in shades of purple and gold, while above them, stars began appearing with the clarity that only existed far from urban light pollution. For a moment, the three of them stood together in comfortable silence, breathing air that carried the salt scent of the ocean and the promise of possibilities that none of them had imagined when a helicopter had made an emergency landing 3 days earlier. Vivienne's proposal came on a Thursday morning that dawned clear and bright, with the kind of coastal sunshine that made even abandoned industrial buildings look hopeful. She'd called a meeting at the town hall, working through Mayor Patricia Thornton to gather community leaders and former plant workers for what she described as a discussion of economic development possibilities. Cal arrived to find the meeting room fuller than it had been since the plant closure announcement 3 years earlier. Jimmy Patterson sat in the front row beside Maria Santos and Tom Miller. Mrs. Chen had closed her bakery for the morning to attend. Even Rick Martinez had remained in town, his pilot's curiosity apparently piqued by the mysterious gathering. Vivienne stood at the front of the room with a presentation screen and the kind of nervous energy that Cal had never seen from her before. She'd traded her usual elegant attire for a business suit that managed to convey both professionalism and accessibility, clearly expensive, but not ostentatiously so. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice carrying the controlled confidence of someone who'd made presentations to hostile audiences before. "I want to talk to you about an opportunity that could transform this community. But first, I need to share some information about myself that will help you understand why I'm here." She clicked to her first slide, which displayed the logo of Roth Industries, along with a corporate overview that revealed the scope of her business empire. Cal felt his stomach tighten as he recognized the implications of what he was seeing. This wasn't just a wealthy woman with philanthropic inclinations, but a major player in the kind of corporate consolidation that had destroyed communities like Millbrook. Roth Industries specializes in technology acquisition and strategic restructuring. Vivienne continued, her voice maintaining its professional tone despite the tension that was beginning to fill the room. "Over the past 15 years, we've acquired 43 companies across various sectors, integrating their technologies and optimizing their operations for maximum efficiency." Jimmy Patterson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "What does that have to do with us?" Vivienne clicked to the next slide, and Cal felt the bottom drop out of his world. The screen displayed a corporate acquisition timeline that included an entry from 3 years earlier. Coastal Aerospace Holdings, acquired by Meridian Capital Partners, subsidiary of Roth Industries. Assets transferred to offshore production facilities. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Cal stared at the screen, processing information that recontextualized every conversation they'd had, every moment of growing trust and connection. The woman who'd listened to his bitter recounting of how corporate greed had destroyed his community was revealing herself as an architect of that very destruction. "You," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made others in the room turn to look at him. "Your company bought us out. You're the reason the plant closed." Vivienne met his gaze directly, her professional composure wavering for the first time since she'd begun speaking. "Yes," she said simply. "My company acquired Coastal Aerospace as part of a larger consolidation strategy. The decision to transfer production overseas was made by my strategic planning team based on cost analysis and market projections." The room erupted in angry voices as the implications sank in. Tom Miller stood up abruptly, his face flushed with indignation. "You came here pretending to be interested in our community, pretending to care about what happened to us, when you're the one who destroyed our lives. I understand your anger," Vivienne said, raising her voice to be heard over the growing tumult. "But please, let me finish. What I'm proposing now is a chance to reverse what was done." "Reverse it?" Maria Santos's voice carried bitter laughter. "You can't reverse 3 years of unemployment, 3 years of families moving away, 3 years of watching our town die." Cal remained seated, but his hands were clenched so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. The betrayal cut deeper than the original plant closure because it was personal now. He'd allowed himself to trust this woman, to believe that she represented something different from the faceless corporate forces that had upended his life. Worse, he'd let Lila grow attached to her, had allowed his daughter to hope for a future that included someone who'd been lying to them from the moment she stepped out of her helicopter. "You're right," Vivian said, her voice cutting through the angry murmur that filled the room. "I can't reverse the damage that was done. I can't give back the 3 years of struggle, the families that moved away, the dreams that were deferred or abandoned entirely. But I can offer something else." She clicked to the next slide, which displayed architectural renderings of a modern manufacturing facility. "I'm proposing to invest $75 million in rebuilding the Aerospace plant, not as a subsidiary of an offshore operation, but as an independent facility dedicated to high-precision manufacturing for the American aerospace industry." The proposal was stunning in its scope and audacity. Cal found himself staring at detailed financial projections that outlined job creation timelines, wage structures that exceeded the old plant's compensation levels, and profit-sharing arrangements that would make workers stakeholders in the facility's success. The new plant would employ 400 people initially, with plans to expand to 600 within 5 years, Vivienne continued, her presentation moving through slides that detailed training programs, community investment initiatives, and environmental improvements that would make the facility a model for sustainable manufacturing. "Why?" Jimmy Patterson's question cut through the stunned silence that had replaced the earlier anger. "Why would you do this? What's in it for you?" Vivienne clicked to a slide that showed not financial projections, but a photograph of Lila demonstrating her airplane project at the science fair. "Because I've spent the last week learning what community actually means. Because I've met an 8-year-old girl who understands more about what matters in life than I've learned in 38 years. Because I've discovered that some mistakes are too important to leave unfixed." Cal stared at his daughter's image on the screen, feeling something crack inside his chest. The gesture was manipulative and heartfelt in equal measure, designed to appeal to his paternal instincts while acknowledging the genuine connection that had developed between Vivienne and Lila. "There are conditions," Vivienne continued. "The facility would be structured as a worker-owned cooperative, with employees holding 40% equity stake. Local hiring would be prioritized, with mandatory training programs for community members who want to develop manufacturing skills, and—" She paused, her eyes finding Cal's across the room. "The plant would require a director of engineering operations, someone with deep aerospace experience and strong community ties. Someone who understands both the technical requirements and the human impact of manufacturing decisions." The offer hung in the air like a challenge and an apology combined. Cal realized that she was offering him not just a job, but a chance to rebuild everything that had been taken from him: his career, his community's economic foundation, his sense of purpose in work that mattered. But the offer came poisoned with the knowledge of who she really was, what role she'd played in creating the devastation she now proposed to repair. Could he trust someone who'd spent 3 years hiding her identity while observing the consequences of her decisions? Could he work with someone who represented everything he'd learned to despise about corporate power? "I need to think about this," Cal said finally, his voice barely audible over the buzz of conversations that had broken out across the room. "Of course," Vivienne replied. "All of you need time to consider what I'm proposing, but I want you to understand that this isn't a philanthropic gesture or a public relations campaign. This is my attempt to prove that American manufacturing can be profitable while remaining loyal to American communities." As the meeting broke up into smaller groups of heated discussion, Cal found himself walking toward the exit without speaking to anyone. The morning that had begun with hope and possibility had transformed into something much more complex, an opportunity that came wrapped in betrayal, a chance for redemption that required trusting someone who'd already proven capable of devastating deception. Outside the town hall, he stood in the parking lot, looking toward the abandoned plant, while trying to process emotions that ranged from fury to hope to something that might have been heartbreak. Behind him, he could hear Vivienne's voice as she answered questions from community members who were wrestling with their own complex reactions to her proposal. The hardest part was acknowledging that despite everything he now knew about her, despite the fundamental dishonesty that had marked their relationship from the beginning, the opportunity she was offering represented exactly what he'd been hoping for since the day the original plant closed. The chance to rebuild not just his career, but his community's future. The possibility that Lila might grow up in a place where engineering excellence was valued and rewarded, where honest work created genuine prosperity. But at what cost? And could he trust that the woman who'd hidden her identity for a week, who'd allowed him to pour out his grief and anger without revealing her role in causing it, was now being completely honest about her motivations? As Cal drove home through streets that might soon bustle with the activity of a revitalized community, he found himself facing the most difficult decision of his life, whether to embrace an opportunity that could restore everything he'd lost, or to reject it based on the betrayal that had made it possible. The days following Vivienne's revelation fractured Millbrook's tight-knit community along lines that hadn't existed since the original plant closure. Cal found himself at the epicenter of heated discussions that erupted wherever neighbors gathered: the hardware store, the diner, the school pickup line, even Mrs. Chen's bakery, where conversations that had once focused on weather and local gossip now revolved around questions of forgiveness, opportunity, and the price of redemption. "You can't seriously be considering this," Jimmy Patterson said as he and Cal stood outside the elementary school waiting for their children. "She lied to us for a week, watched us pour our hearts out about losing our jobs, never once mentioning that she was the one who took them away." Cal's response came slowly, weighted with the complexity of emotions he'd been wrestling with since the town hall meeting. "But what if she's sincere about making amends? What if this is our only chance to get back what we lost?" "Some things can't be gotten back, Cal. Trust, for one thing. How do you work with someone who's already proven she'll deceive you when it suits her purposes?" The conversation reflected similar debates happening throughout the community. Tom Miller had closed his hardware store early 2 days, running to attend impromptu gatherings where former plant workers struggled to reconcile their economic desperation with their sense of betrayal. Maria Santos found herself torn between the genuine care Vivienne had shown for her daughter at the science fair and the knowledge that this same woman had been responsible for Maria's 3 years of financial struggle. At the center of these community divisions, Cal faced personal challenges that went beyond economic considerations. Lila had grown genuinely attached to Vivienne during her extended stay, asking daily when Mrs. Vivienne would visit again and why her father seemed so sad whenever her name came up. "Daddy, did Mrs. Vivienne do something wrong?" Lila asked during their evening walk along the coastal path that had become their routine for processing difficult conversations. Cal struggled to find words that would explain adult complexities to an 8-year-old's understanding. Sometimes grown-ups make decisions that hurt other people, even when they don't mean to. And sometimes they try to fix the hurt later, but that doesn't make the original decision okay. But if she's trying to fix it, isn't that good? The question cut to the heart of Cal's dilemma. How did you explain to a child that good intentions couldn't erase past harm, that trust once broken required more than grand gestures to repair? How did you balance the community's need for economic revival against the principle that actions should have consequences? "It's complicated, sweetheart," he said finally, knowing the answer was inadequate but unable to offer anything more complete. Meanwhile, Vivienne had taken up temporary residence at the inn while working to address the community's concerns through what could only be described as a campaign of radical transparency. She'd hired a local accountant to review her financial projections, brought in independent labor consultants to verify her worker ownership proposals, and even arranged for former employees of her other acquisitions to speak via video conference about their experiences with Roth Industries' restructuring efforts. The picture that emerged was complex and troubling. Yes, her company had a track record of closing American manufacturing facilities in favor of offshore production. But it also showed genuine attempts to retrain displaced workers, substantial severance packages that exceeded industry standards, and in several cases, successful facility relocations that had preserved jobs even while changing their geographic locations. "She's not the cartoon villain we want her to be," Mayor Thornton observed during a coffee meeting with Cal at the diner. "That almost makes it harder. If she were purely exploitative, the decision would be easier." Cal stirred his coffee absently, watching through the window as Vivienne walked past on her way to another community meeting. She'd changed during the week since her revelation. The corporate polish had been replaced by something more authentic, as if the act of finally telling the truth had freed her to be more genuinely herself. "Have you talked to her directly?" the mayor asked. "Since the meeting, I mean." "No," Cal admitted. "I don't know what I'd say. Part of me wants to tell her exactly what I think of people who destroy communities for profit. Part of me wants to ask her what she really hopes to accomplish here. And part of you what?" Cal was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with admissions that felt too personal to voice. "Part of me misses talking to her. Before I knew who she was, those conversations were different. She listened in ways that people don't usually listen. She asked questions that made me think about things I'd stopped thinking about." "That person is still there, Cal. The deception doesn't erase everything else you experienced." The observation forced Cal to confront truths he'd been avoiding. His anger at Vivienne's deception was justified, but it coexisted with genuine care for the woman who'd sat in his shop, asking thoughtful questions about his daughter's dreams and his own lost ambitions. The corporate executive who'd authorized the plant's closure was the same person who'd spent an evening helping Lila understand aerodynamic principles with patience and genuine enthusiasm. 3 days before the community was scheduled to vote on Vivienne's proposal, Cal found an envelope slipped under his shop door. Inside was a handwritten letter, not the typed corporate communication he might have expected, but pages of carefully composed thoughts in handwriting that revealed the deliberate consideration behind each word. "Cal," the letter began, "I know you don't want to speak with me, and I understand why. But there are things I need you to know before the community makes its decision, things that might help you understand not just what I'm proposing, but why it matters to me personally." The letter went on to detail aspects of Vivienne's background that she'd never shared during their conversations. Her childhood in a Rust Belt town not unlike Millbrook, where her father had worked in a steel mill that closed when she was 12. Her mother's struggles to find work that paid enough to keep their family housed and fed. Her own determination to succeed in business, partially driven by the desire never to feel that vulnerable again. "I became everything I once hated," she wrote. "Someone who made decisions based on spreadsheets instead of human faces, who optimized for profit margins while ignoring the communities that got destroyed in the process. The acquisition of Coastal Aerospace wasn't personal, it wasn't even a decision I made directly. It was handled by my strategic planning team as part of a portfolio optimization that I approved without ever visiting Millbrook or meeting the people who would be affected." The letter continued with details about her growing awareness of the human cost of her business practices, an awareness that had been building for months before her helicopter's emergency landing had forced her to confront those costs directly. "Meeting you and Lila changed something fundamental about how I understand success," she wrote. "Watching you build a meaningful life from the wreckage of circumstances that my decisions helped create showed me what I'd been missing in my own life. I'm not asking for forgiveness, what I did was wrong, and good intentions don't erase bad consequences. But I am asking for the chance to prove that people can change, that mistakes can lead to better choices." The letter concluded with a revelation that surprised Cal. Regardless of whether the community accepted her proposal, Vivienne had already begun liquidating portions of her business empire to fund restitution payments to workers displaced by her company's previous acquisitions. "This isn't about my reputation or my business interests," she wrote. "This is about trying to become someone I can respect, someone who uses power to build rather than destroy. I hope you'll give me that chance, but I understand if you can't." Cal read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of complexity in a situation that had seemed straightforward in its awfulness. The woman who'd deceived him was also the woman who was risking her financial empire to make amends for past decisions. The corporate executive who'd authorized his community's destruction was also the person who'd sat on his shop floor helping his daughter build model airplanes. As the community vote approached, Cal found himself facing a decision that would determine not just his own future, but the direction of Millbrook's recovery and the nature of his relationship with a woman who represented both his greatest betrayal and his best hope for redemption. The choice would require him to weigh his desire for justice against his community's need for opportunity, his personal anger against the possibility of genuine transformation. Outside his shop, the abandoned aerospace plant stood silhouetted against the evening sky, waiting to learn whether it would remain a monument to economic devastation or become the foundation for something unprecedented. The corporation's attempt to rebuild what it had once destroyed, led by people who understood both the human cost of failure and the precious value of second chances. The town hall meeting, scheduled for 7 o'clock on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening, drew the largest crowd in Millbrook's recent memory. Cars lined both sides of Main Street, while overflow attendees stood beneath umbrellas outside the building, their conversations creating a low murmur that spoke of a community grappling with its most important decision in decades. Cal arrived 20 minutes early to find the meeting room already packed, with folding chairs arranged in rows that couldn't accommodate everyone who'd come to witness or participate in the discussion. He recognized faces from across the community's social and economic spectrum: plant workers, small business owners, retirees who'd watched their property values decline with the town's fortunes, young families weighing whether to stay or seek opportunities elsewhere. Vivienne sat in the front row beside Mayor Thornton, her posture reflecting the controlled tension of someone who understood that her future, and the community's, would be determined by the next 2 hours of discussion. She dressed simply dark slacks and a modest blouse that suggested respect for the gravity of the occasion, without the ostentatious humility that might have appeared calculated. "Before we begin the formal presentation and discussion," Mayor Thornton announced as the room gradually quieted, "I want everyone to understand the ground rules. This is about one question: whether our community will accept Ms. Roth's proposal to rebuild the aerospace manufacturing facility. We'll hear from Ms. Roth first, then open the floor for questions and comments from community members." As Vivienne rose to address the crowd, Cal noted how different she appeared from the confident executive who'd emerged from the helicopter 2 weeks earlier. The corporate polish remained, but it was tempered now by something that looked like genuine humility, the demeanor of someone who'd learned that real leadership sometimes meant accepting responsibility for failures rather than claiming credit for successes. "2 weeks ago, my helicopter made an emergency landing in your community," she began, her voice carrying clearly to the back of the room despite the absence of amplification equipment. "I came here as a stranger, and I leave as someone who's been fundamentally changed by what I've learned about what community actually means." She paused, her gaze moving across the faces before her people whose lives had been shaped by her corporate decisions in ways she was only beginning to understand. "I've spent the last week providing you with detailed financial projections, independent verification of my proposals, and complete transparency about my company's history. But I want to start tonight with something more important than numbers: an acknowledgement of the harm that my decisions caused, and an explanation of why I believe rebuilding is both necessary and possible." The room remained silent as Vivienne outlined her proposal with the precision that had made her successful in corporate boardrooms, but with emotional context that those presentations had never included. The new plant would employ 400 people initially, with wages that exceeded the region's manufacturing average, and benefits that included profit sharing, continuing education support, and worker representation on the facility's board of directors. "This isn't charity," she continued, anticipating objections that several community members were already formulating. "The business model is sound, the market demand is real, and the financial projections assume normal competitive pressures. What makes this different is the commitment to keeping jobs and profits in the community that creates them. Jimmy Patterson was the first to speak when the floor opened for questions, his voice carrying the weight of 3 years' worth of economic struggle. "Miss Roth, you're asking us to trust you with our future after you've already proven you'll sacrifice our community for corporate profits. What guarantee do we have that you won't make the same decision again when market conditions change?" The question drew nods and murmurs of agreement from across the room. Vivian had clearly anticipated it, but her response carried the kind of personal vulnerability that corporate training programs never addressed. "You don't have any guarantees, Jimmy," she said, using his first name with the familiarity of someone who'd spent 2 weeks learning the community's interconnections. "I can't promise that market forces won't change, that global competition won't intensify, or that unforeseen circumstances won't create pressure for difficult decisions. What I can promise is that I've learned something about the cost of treating communities as expendable resources, and I won't make that mistake again." Tom Miller raised his hand next, his hardware store owner's pragmatism evident in his question. "The financial projections look good on paper, but they assume a lot of variables going in our favor. What happens if the contracts don't materialize, if the training programs don't work, if the whole thing fails? Then I lose $75 million, and this community is no worse off than it is today." Vivienne replied. "The facility would be structured so that failure wouldn't create debt obligations for the community or individual workers. The risk is entirely mine." Maria Santos stood up from the middle of the room, her question reflecting concerns that went beyond economics. "My daughter really likes you, Miss Roth. She talks about you all the time, about the helicopter and the science fair, and how you listen to her explain her project, but she doesn't understand why the adults are so angry. How do I explain to her that people she cares about might not be trustworthy?" The question hit Vivienne with visible impact, her composed demeanor wavering as she confronted the personal dimensions of her deception. "I don't know, Maria," she said quietly. "That's probably the question that keeps me awake at night. I never intended for children to be affected by my business decisions, but intention doesn't matter when the consequences are real." As the questions continued, a complex picture emerged of a community wrestling with competing impulses. The economic opportunity was undeniable. 400 well-paying jobs in a town where meaningful employment had become increasingly scarce. But accepting the proposal meant trusting someone who'd already demonstrated her willingness to prioritize profit over community welfare. Mrs. Chen, whose bakery had survived the economic downturn through sheer determination and community loyalty, posed perhaps the most direct question: "Why should we believe that you've changed? People in positions of power say they've learned from their mistakes all the time, but how often do they actually behave differently?" Vivienne's answer came after a long pause, during which the only sound was rain against the town hall's windows. "You shouldn't believe I've changed based on what I say," she replied. "You should judge me based on what I do. I'm not asking for trust. I'm asking for the opportunity to earn it through actions rather than words." The discussion continued for nearly an hour, with voices from across the community spectrum weighing in on questions that ranged from technical details about manufacturing processes to fundamental concerns about corporate responsibility and community self-determination. Through it all, Cal remained silent, listening to his neighbors' articulate fears and hopes that reflected his own internal struggle. As the formal question period concluded, Mayor Thornton called for final statements from anyone who wished to address the community before the vote. Several people spoke some in favor of accepting the proposal based on economic necessity. Others opposed based on the principle that past betrayals shouldn't be rewarded with future opportunities. When the mayor asked if anyone else wanted to speak, Cal found himself standing before he'd consciously decided to do so. The room fell silent as attention focused on the man whose expertise and community standing made his opinion particularly significant. "I've been sitting here listening to all of you wrestle with this decision," he began, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. And I realize that every argument I've heard tonight, every concern and every hope, is something I've been carrying around in my own head for the last week." He paused, looking across the faces of neighbors who'd become friends through shared struggle, people who'd supported each other through the worst economic crisis in their community's history. "I think we're asking the wrong question," he continued. "We're asking whether we can trust Vivian Roth, whether her motives are pure, whether her transformation is genuine. But maybe the real question is whether we can trust ourselves to make this work, whether we have the strength and wisdom to accept an opportunity without letting it compromise our values." Cal's words hung in the air like a challenge that reframed the entire evening's discussion. Around the room, faces that had been etched with uncertainty began to show something different. Not resolution, exactly, but a new way of thinking about the choice before them. "What I mean is this," Cal continued, his engineer's mind organizing complex thoughts into logical progression. "Vivienne Roth made decisions that devastated our community. That's a fact we can't change. But we're not being asked to forgive those decisions or pretend they didn't happen. We're being asked whether we can use this opportunity to rebuild something better than what we lost." He turned slightly, his gaze finding Vivienne in the front row. "You ask if we can trust you, and honestly, I don't know. Trust isn't something that gets rebuilt with grand gestures or good intentions. Trust gets rebuilt through daily choices, through keeping commitments when it's difficult, through choosing community welfare over personal profit every single time that choice presents itself." Vivienne met his gaze directly, her expression showing both appreciation for his honesty and understanding of the challenge he was articulating. "But here's what I do know," Cal continued, turning back to address the community. "I know Jimmy Patterson, who hasn't missed a day of work in 3 years, even though his commute costs him 2 hours and a tank of gas. I know Maria Santos, who's gone back to school while working 2 jobs because she refuses to let circumstances define her future. I know Tom Miller, who's kept his store open during the worst recession in our lifetimes because he understands that communities need gathering places where neighbors can support each other." As Cal spoke, something shifted in the room's atmosphere. The focus was moving away from Vivienne's past failures toward the community's demonstrated resilience and strength. "I know Mrs. Chen, who's fed half the families in this room when they couldn't afford groceries, never asking for recognition or repayment. I know teachers who've spent their own money on school supplies, volunteer coaches who've organized youth programs without funding, neighbors who've helped each other through medical crises and family emergencies." Cal's voice grew stronger as he warmed to his theme. "We've survived 3 years of economic devastation, not because we're perfect, but because we understand something that corporate spreadsheets can't measure, the value of genuine community. That's not something Vivienne Roth can take away from us, no matter what decisions she makes in the future." Jimmy Patterson spoke up from his seat. "So you're saying we should accept her proposal?" "I'm saying we should accept it or reject it, based on whether it serves our community's interests, not whether it satisfies our desire for justice," Cal replied. "Those are 2 different questions, and we can't let our legitimate anger cloud our judgment about what's best for our children's futures." Tom Miller stood up, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd served as an informal community leader throughout the crisis. "Cal's right about our strength as a community. But I want to hear from Ms. Roth about something specific. What happens when the first crisis hits, when market conditions change, when production costs rise, when shareholders start demanding higher profits? How do we know you won't revert to the same decision-making process that destroyed the original plant?" Vivienne rose to respond, her demeanor showing the gravity she accorded the question. "Tom, I can't promise that crises won't come. They always do in manufacturing. But I can promise that any future decisions will be made with full community participation. The worker ownership structure isn't just about profit sharing. It's about ensuring that people who live with the consequences of business decisions have a voice in making them." "That sounds good in theory," Maria Santos interjected. "But when push comes to shove, when you're facing real financial pressure, will you really honor that commitment?" Vivian paused, then walked to the presentation screen where her financial projections were still displayed. "Let me show you something that's not in my formal proposal," she said, pulling up a new document on her laptop. The screen now showed a legal framework that stunned the room into silence. An irrevocable trust structure that would transfer ownership of the facility to the community after 5 years of successful operation, with Vivienne retaining only a minority interest and advisory role. "This isn't about maintaining control," she said quietly. "This is about proving that American manufacturing can be profitable while remaining loyal to American communities. After 5 years, this facility will belong to Millbrook, not to me. My success will be measured by whether I've built something sustainable enough to survive without my involvement." The revelation transformed the dynamic of the discussion entirely. What had appeared to be a traditional corporate investment now revealed itself as something unprecedented. A wealthy individual's attempt to return economic control to the community that had been harmed by her previous decisions. Cal felt something unlock in his chest, a recognition that the proposal represented exactly the kind of principled risk-taking that distinguished genuine leadership from mere management. "Why didn't you lead with that?" he asked. "Because I wanted you to make the decision based on the business proposal, not on gestures that might seem designed to manipulate your emotions," Vivienne replied. "The facility has to succeed as a manufacturing operation first. Everything else is meaningless if we can't build aircraft components that meet quality standards and delivery schedules." Mayor Thornton called for a 10-minute recess to allow people to discuss this new information, and the room immediately erupted into intense conversations. Cal found himself surrounded by neighbors seeking his opinion, their questions reflecting the complexity of a decision that had become even more significant with Vivienne's latest revelation. "What do you think, Cal?" Mrs. Chen asked. "Can we trust her to honor this commitment?" "I think the legal structure makes trust less relevant," Cal replied. "If she's willing to put irrevocable community ownership into writing, then our success depends more on our ability to make good decisions than on her willingness to keep promises." When the meeting reconvened, Mayor Thornton called for the formal vote. "All those in favor of accepting Miss Roth's proposal, please raise your hands." The response was overwhelming. Nearly every hand in the room rose, including some that belonged to people who'd been vocally skeptical throughout the evening's discussion. The vote wasn't unanimous. Several community members remained opposed on principle, but the margin was decisive enough to constitute a clear mandate. As hands were counted and the result announced, Cal felt a mixture of relief, hope, and lingering uncertainty that he suspected would characterize the months ahead. They'd chosen to embrace an extraordinary opportunity, but the real work of rebuilding their community was just beginning. Vivienne's response to the vote was notably restrained, a simple nod of acknowledgement rather than celebration. "Thank you," she said to the room. "I understand the trust you're placing in me, and I won't take it lightly. The real work starts tomorrow." As the meeting concluded and people began filing out into the rain-soaked evening, Cal found himself approaching Vivienne with a mixture of determination and residual anger that would need to be resolved if they were going to work together. "I'll take the position," he said quietly, "Director of Engineering Operations. But I want you to understand something. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for this community, for my daughter's future, and for the chance to prove that manufacturing can still matter in America." Vivienne extended her hand with the solemnity of someone who understood that she was accepting not just partnership, but ongoing accountability to people who'd suffered because of her previous decisions. "I understand," she said as they shook hands, "and I'm grateful for the chance to prove that people can change, that mistakes can lead to better choices." Outside, the rain had stopped, and stars were beginning to appear through breaks in the clouds. Reminder that even the darkest nights eventually gave way to clearer skies, and that the most important transformations often began with the courage to trust in possibilities that couldn't be guaranteed. 6 months later, the sound of construction machinery had become the rhythm of Millbrook's renaissance. Cal stood at the edge of what would soon be the main assembly floor of the new coastal aerospace facility, watching workers install precision manufacturing equipment that represented the fusion of cutting-edge technology with time-tested craftsmanship. The building itself had been transformed from an abandoned monument to economic devastation into something that hummed with purposeful activity and genuine hope. The bearing assemblies are running 3 days ahead of schedule, Rick Martinez reported as he approached with a clipboard full of progress updates. The former helicopter pilot had accepted a position as the facility's logistics coordinator, his decades of aviation experience proving invaluable in coordinating the complex dance of equipment installation, worker training, and contract negotiations. Cal nodded, his attention focused on a group of trainees who were learning to operate computer-controlled machining equipment under the supervision of Maria Santos. She'd completed an accelerated certification program and emerged as one of the facility's most capable technical supervisors, her combination of quick learning and natural leadership making her invaluable in bridging the gap between new technology and experienced workers. "Any word from the FAA certification team?" Cal asked. "They'll be here next week for the final inspection. Vivienne thinks we'll have preliminary approval for the Navy contract by the end of the month." The mention of Vivienne's name no longer carried the complex emotional weight it once had, though Cal's relationship with her remained carefully professional. She'd proven as good as her word in every commitment she'd made to the community, but the foundation of trust between them was still under construction, built incrementally through daily demonstrations of integrity rather than grand gestures. "Daddy, Daddy." Lila's voice echoed across the construction site as she ran toward him with the enthusiasm that marked her after-school visits to what she'd dubbed the airplane factory. At 9 years old, she'd grown into the role of unofficial facility mascot, charming workers with her endless questions about manufacturing processes and her uncanny ability to spot quality control issues that sometimes escaped adult attention. "How was school, sweetheart?" Cal asked, kneeling to receive the hug that remained the best part of every workday. "Great. Mrs. Rodriguez says I can enter my new project in the regional science fair next month. It's about how computer programming helps make airplane parts more precise." The project reflected Lila's growing sophistication in understanding the intersection of technology and manufacturing, but it also represented something more significant. A child who was growing up in a community where engineering excellence was valued and rewarded, where her curiosity about how things worked was met with resources and encouragement rather than the limitations that had defined her father's recent past. "Where's Mrs. Vivienne?" Lila asked, looking around the facility with the expectation of someone whose daily routine included interactions with the woman who'd become an unexpected but important part of their lives. "She's in Boston today, meeting with potential clients," Cal replied. "But she'll be back tomorrow for the quarterly board meeting." The board meetings had become exercises in collaborative decision-making that confounded traditional corporate hierarchies. Worker representatives sat alongside technical experts and community leaders to make decisions about production schedules, quality standards, and facility improvements. The process was sometimes slower than traditional corporate governance, but it generated buy-in and accountability that made implementation more effective. As the afternoon wound down, Cal found himself walking through the facility with the kind of quiet satisfaction that came from seeing abstract plans transformed into concrete reality. The machine shop where Jimmy Patterson now operated precision equipment that would have seemed like science fiction during his old assembly line days. The quality control department where Mrs. W. Bryce, Chen's daughter, Jessica, had found her calling in statistical analysis and process improvement. The training center where Tom Miller taught safety protocols to new workers, his hardware store experience proving surprisingly relevant to industrial safety management. The transformation extended beyond the facility itself. Main Street showed signs of renewed vitality as businesses reopened to serve the facility's 400 employees. The elementary school had hired 2 new teachers to accommodate families who'd moved back to Millbrook. The real estate market, dormant for 3 years, had begun showing modest but steady improvement as people invested in a community that once again offered the prospect of stable, meaningful employment. But perhaps the most significant transformation was in Cal himself. The bitter resignation that had marked his demeanor since Sarah's death had been replaced by something approaching contentment, not the naive optimism of someone who'd never faced serious loss, but the deeper satisfaction of someone who'd rebuilt meaning from the wreckage of circumstances beyond his control. "Cal," Vivian's voice interrupted his reflection as she appeared in the facility's main entrance, her business trip evidently concluded earlier than expected. She'd changed during the months of working together, her corporate polish evolving into something more authentic and approachable. Success was still important to her, but it was measured now in terms of community impact rather than personal wealth accumulation. "How did the meetings go in Boston?" he asked as she approached. "Better than expected. We've got preliminary interest from 3 new clients, including a contract that could expand our workforce to 600 within 18 months. She paused, studying his expression. "Assuming the community wants that kind of growth." The qualifier reflected lessons learned about the importance of community input in business decisions. Vivienne had discovered that sustainable success required constant attention to balancing growth opportunities with community values, economic development with environmental stewardship, profit margins with worker welfare. "I think we can handle growth, as long as it's planned carefully," Cal replied. "The training programs are working better than anyone expected, and we've got a waiting list of people who want to join the next certification cycle." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the end-of-shift transition as first-shift workers handed off responsibilities to their second-shift counterparts. The facility operated with the kind of collaborative efficiency that reflected not just good management, but genuine investment by workers who understood that their individual success was tied directly to collective achievement. "Lila's science fair project sounds impressive," Vivienne said, her interest in the girl's development having evolved from polite attention to genuine investment in her future. "She wants to study aerospace engineering in college," Cal replied, "though she's also considering marine biology and veterinary medicine, so we'll see where her interests settle. Whatever she chooses, she'll have options. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Making sure our kids have choices we didn't have." The comment reflected a truth that had emerged gradually during their months of working together. The recognition that the facility's success would ultimately be measured not in quarterly profits or annual production numbers, but in the opportunities it created for the next generation of Millbrook residents. As evening approached and the facility settled into its night shift rhythm, Cal prepared to head home to the modest house where he and Lila had built a life that honored Sarah's memory while embracing the possibility of new beginnings. The wedding ring he'd worn for 2 years after Sarah's death had been retired to a jewelry box where it remained as a treasured reminder rather than a barrier to moving forward. "Cal," Vivienne said as they reached the parking lot, "thank you." "For what?" "For giving me the chance to prove that people can change. For teaching me what community actually means. For showing me that the most important success isn't about what you achieve, but about what you build for others." Cal considered her words, recognizing the sincerity behind them while maintaining the boundaries that would always define their relationship. "You've earned the gratitude, Vivienne. This community is better because of the choices you've made. But don't forget that those choices will need to be made again tomorrow and the day after that, and every day for as long as this facility operates." "I won't forget," she promised. As Cal drove home through streets that bustled with the activity of a community that had rediscovered its sense of purpose, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. A helicopter's emergency landing had become the catalyst for transformation that none of them could have imagined. Not just the rebuilding of a manufacturing facility, but the reconstruction of hope, the restoration of dignity and honest work, and the recognition that the most shocking thing someone could say wasn't always what you expected to hear. Sometimes he realized the most shocking thing was simply the truth, that people could change, that communities could rebuild, and that the future didn't have to be limited by the failures of the past. In the end, that truth had proven more powerful than any corporate strategy or economic theory, more lasting than profit margins or quarterly reports. It was, quite simply, enough to build a life upon.